Hello class, Professor Seeger here again. This is the second part of my lecture on the sonnet. As with the first part, this is the time in the program to remove yourself from any distractions and to gather a pen and paper to take notes. And as always, if the presentation goes too fast, do not hesitate to pause it or replay it as often as you need to. The Spenserian sonnet, invented by Edmund Spenser, acts to transition between the Italian and English variations. The two major changes are in the rhyme scheme and the placement of the volta. The rhyme scheme tends to influence the connection between the first and second parts of the poem, and the volta makes the poem more imbalanced. You will notice that the volta typically occurs at the end of line 12. Notice, in the Spenserian sonnet, how the pattern of end rhymes continue between quatrains, so that the only dramatic change in rhyme occurs in the final couplet. However, since the B and C rhymes continue in the next stanza, they create kissing rhymes, which work to prepare the reader for the rhyming end couplet. So not only is the Spenserian sonnet a historically transitional form, it is also a form that relies on more subtle transition. The dominating feature of the Spenserian sonnet is the interconnected rhyme scheme. This allows the poem to create more gradual transitions between quatrains and highlight the thematic connection between them. This means that, since the B rhyme is continued in the second quatrain, it highlights various connections with the first, which also tends to coincide with a logical or thematic connection. Consequently, it does not require, as does the Petrarchan sonnet, that the initial setup of a problem is answered in the second half. Instead, each quatrain works to develop three different but connected ideas, showing more of a slight shift in theme or perspective rather than a rhetorical strategy. Often, in a Spenserian sonnet, the ending couplet works to sum up the rest of the poem. The Spenserian sonnet is also considered a softer sonnet because of its lack of rhetorical definition due to its more subtle transitions. In this famous poem by Spenser, you will notice that the first 12 lines are a back and forth conversation between two people, wherein each quatrain signifies a switch in speakers, while the ending couplet acts as the poem's speaker trying to resolve the literal argument developed in the rest of the poem. Therefore, while the theme is constant, the perspective changes with each quatrain. The overlapping of the rhyme in this poem also works to show that this is one continuous conversation that builds upon and responds to what the other says, as opposed to conversations where one or both parties are not listening to each other, but just keep on talking. Sonnet 75. One day I wrote her name upon the strand, but came the waves and washed it away. Again I wrote it with a second hand, but came the tide and made my pains his prey. Vain man, said she, that doest in vain essay a mortal thing so to immortalize. For I myself shall like to this decay, and eke my name be wiped out likewise. Not so, quoth I, let baser things devise to die in dust, but you shall live by fame. My verse your virtues rare shall eternize, and in the heavens write your glorious name. Where, when as death shall all the world subdue, out love shall live, and later life renew. When looking at this poem, what do you notice about the effects of this form compared to the typical form of the Italian sonnet? What does this form reinforce about the romantic relationship? And conversely, what does the Italian sonnet's form suggest about the romantic relationship? How are they different? Hmm. Although sonnets had been a part of England's literary landscape since 1557, it wasn't until the publication of Sir Philip Sidney's sonnet series Astrophel and Stella in 1591 that the form was widely popularized and quickly became the fashionable way for various poets to proclaim their love. However, despite the immediate changes in meter and rhyme scheme the sonnet adopted when it made its way to England, for an example, please look at Surrey's translation of Petrarch in part 1 of this lecture. Sonnets, aside from those of Spenser, still typically followed the Italian form in terms of the volta placement and rhetorical sensibilities, although, of course, there have always been instances of sonnet variations, even early on. Remember, even when Petrarch was defining the form, he had variations of that form, even in his long sonnet sequence to a lady he named Laura. The Elizabethan or Shakespearean sonnet is defined by two major formal differences from the Italian sonnet that reflect dramatic, aesthetic, tonal, and often thematic differences. The Elizabethan sonnet is differentiated from the Italian and Spenserian sonnets by its formal differences in rhyme scheme, as well as the nature and effect of the volta, which, like the Spenserian sonnet, occurs in the ending rhyming couplet, however, often to much different effect. These changes lend to dramatic differences in the sonnet's tone and nature. The changes in rhyme scheme divide the poem into four distinct sections, often signaling a short transition between each. Sometimes, like the Spenserian sonnet, these quatrains take a slightly different perspective on a theme. The change might also be syntactical or tonal. However, the general consensus is that the change is relatively minor compared to the dramatic change of the volta in the last two lines. The defining characteristic and change of the volta in the ending couplet places here to creates a strong imbalance in the poem and does not allow the poet the space to develop a logical, well-considered resolution to the concern raised in the first part of the poem. Instead, the volta in the Elizabethan sonnet is most often used to either summarize the first part of the poem, place the first part of the poem in a new light, or by ending as a sort of parting shot or punchline. This use of the volta relies less on the poet's contemplative abilities and more on the poet's sense of wordplay and wit. This wit and wordplay can be seen in several of Shakespeare's sonnets, but perhaps none show this as dramatically as Sonnet 130. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. My mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hair be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked, red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go. My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she, belied with false compare. You will see that not only does the first quatrain end with a period, but that the beginning of the second stanza is the first direct observation by the speaker. The beginning of the third quatrain, then, is the first time that the poem speaker proclaims his love for the mistress. Up until this point in the poem, the comparisons and images seem little more than insults. This mention of love works to set up and foreshadow the ending couplet, which works not only to transform all those unflattering images in the first 12 lines into a compliment, but he also is able to take a stab at his contemporary sonneteers and their tendency to utilize hyperbole when comparing their own beloved to celestial things. He is in effect saying, "My love is stronger because I am more realistic." Of course, this is an oversimplification of the poem. In this lecture, I have only dealt with three of the more recognized versions of the sonnet. Each sonneteer, of course, creates their own variations to the form, and usually feels free to switch from variation to variation as their subject matter allows. Of Shakespeare's 154 sonnets, several were Petrarchan in nature, and one was even 15 lines. This shows that the key to a sonnet series is to offer variation. As you can see, although these variations might be relatively minor, they allow the poet enough variety to make things interesting, and for them to say what they want or need to say. Gerard Manley Hopkins created a shortened version called a curtal sonnet, which never really gained popularity. There are dozens of other sonnet variations, and perhaps dozen more when the sonnet moves to France, Germany, and Spain, and so on. Part of the fun and vibrancy of the form is not only its long and rich tradition and history, but also the flexibility and the room it offers for nearly endless experimentation and variation. Remember, poets often use these variations on the form not only to say what they need to say, but also to comment directly on those traditions and history, and sometimes even criticize them.